brief look at active-passive voice. Now, I know this is something you've gone over before many times, and this is just going to be a short review for you, but I want you to understand how important active-passive voice actually is. Now, the reason we're going to go over this, even though it's only just mentioned slightly in the book, is because it is increasingly important in today's world. Now, any of you that ever plan to work online or in any kind of technical Today we're going to do a brief review of passive-active voice. Now, it's mentioned in the book, but I think it's worth going over. Even though most of you know it, we've done it before, I've never taught it to you in grade 10 or 11, so I think it is worth going over for a brief mention. Now, the reason I've chosen to go over this when it is just a footnote at the bottom of a page is because passive-active voice is increasingly important in today's world. We now get most of our information from websites and from related web material. Most of us don't go to libraries anymore or read books for the things we need to know. Most of us go straight on the internet using Google or whatever, and that's where we get most of our information from. Nothing wrong with that. When you build a website, active and passive voice are extremely important, rather. Things have to be written in active voice because the way people respond to it is completely different. Passive voice is more laid back. It's less important. It drives the message home with much less power. Active voice doesn't do that, which is why when you're building a website, the SEO controls will go through and scan the material that you're putting together and will look for active voice. Passive voice, according to the Wikipedia. Passive voice construction is a grammatical voice construction that is found in many languages. In a clause with passive voice, the grammatical subject expresses the theme or patient of the main verb, that is, the person or thing that undergoes the action or has its state changed. This contrasts with active voice, in which the subject has the agent role. For example, in the passive sentence, the tree was pulled down, the subject, the tree, donates the patient rather than the agent of the action. Makes perfect sense. Let's explain that in a more simple, logical, straightforward way that all of us can understand. Active voice, in simple terms, takes the person who's doing the action and puts them as the subject in the sentence. With passive voice, something else is the subject or the main subject is omitted. Now, we can't take the subject out of a sentence altogether, but the thing that's having the thing done to it would become the subject. So what would normally be the object of the sentence would be treated as the subject. And that gives the entire sentence much less potency and much less power, and it makes the message come across in a softer, less meaningful way. Most sentences can either be written in active or passive voice. We can turn them one way or the other. Some passive voice sentences can't be turned back into active voice, at least not without restructuring the sentence. Many writers say that we should always maximize the active voice, whether we're writing for something political or in modern web design. Active voice is usually the way to go. Passive voice, as I said before, takes out some of the strength of the sentence. If we're trying to make a point, we should never be using passive voice to make it. Passive voice has its place. For this reason, active voice is used in technical journals, it's used in instructions, it's used in explanations. We want to know who's doing the action and why. For that to happen, we need active voice. We need to explain who did what and to whom and for what reason. We can't really do that properly with passive voice. Passive voice has its place, but its place isn't in a sentence that's trying to make an important point about something quickly. Okay, so let's have a look at some simple examples. If you look at the chart on the screen, we've got active and two different versions of passive. Now, in the active sentence, the most usual sentence, we've got the sentence, Rita wrote a letter to me. That's normally what we would say generally when we're speaking to somebody. Now, the subject of this sentence is Rita, the verb is wrote, the object is the letter that went to me. So object 1 is the letter, object 2 is me. Okay? Very simple sentence. Rita wrote a letter to me. Now, if we make that passive, we would change the subject to a letter. The verb would be was written to me, either by Rita or from Rita, and we could take that out as well. We could say a letter was written to me. We don't necessarily have to say it was Rita. And passive 2 would be, I was written a letter by Rita. That makes me the subject of the sentence. The verb remains was written, and the object is the letter, object 2 by Rita, if we need to include that object. As you can see, both versions of the passive voice there are clunky to the point where they just sound wrong. If you were to see those written down on a website or something, they're just not going to look right. Let's have a look at some more examples. So here we've got Rita, she's still writing letters. We've got, in the simple present tense here, we've got Rita writes a letter. Passive version, a letter is written by Rita. Very straightforward. We've got simple past, Rita wrote a letter. In the passive tense, a letter was written by Rita, so we're changing the subject. Present perfect, Rita has written a letter has been written by Rita. We've got future, Rita will write a letter will be written by Rita. And then we've got an example of why you shouldn't always steal charts off of various websites that haven't been completed properly. Rita can write a letter can be written by Rita. Present progressive, Rita is writing a letter, so a letter is being written by Rita. Past progressive, Rita was writing a letter was being written by Rita. Past perfect tense, Rita had written a letter had been written by Rita. Future tense, future 2, Rita will have written a letter will have been written by Rita. Conditional 1, Rita would write a letter would be written by Rita. And conditional 2, Rita would have written a letter would have been written by Rita, but she got too bored of all this letter writing and she gave up, presumably.